Hello and welcome. I'm Professor Lukas, and today we'll be talking about two types of communication, narration and exposition. This information is adapted from Chapter 1, Introduction to College Reading and Writing, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. We constantly tell stories about our experiences. The kind of extended communication that we've practiced and experienced the most from childhood on is storytelling, both in our interactions with others and in written and even theatrical format. Thus, it is natural that when faced with an unfamiliar writing task, people will often fall back on the mode that they're most comfortable and familiar with, storytelling. However, essays generally call for argumentation or exposition rather than merely storytelling. Many people have had the experience of writing what they felt was a great essay, only to receive a poor grade, perhaps with comments about showing, not telling, or not having a focus or thesis. These can all be the result of writing a story, or narrative, instead of the expository text the instructor was looking for. Luckily for you, after reading the chapter and watching this video, you shouldn't make that mistake ever again. Becoming aware of the differences between these two modes of communication can make a big difference in your writing. Let's start with the more familiar type, narration or storytelling. The narrative is just a story. Narration is storytelling or reporting what happened. This is a method of communication we're all familiar with. Whether you're telling your friend about your bad day, saying what happened on your recent trip, or reading a book, we're all surrounded by narration in our everyday lives, and we use this method often. Narration has several identifying features. First, narratives are told in chronological order. You begin at the beginning and go on to the end. You say what happened first, then what happened second, then what happened third, and so on. Another identifying characteristic of narratives is that they are simply reporting events. They're not using those events to prove any particular point, but are merely stating what happened. A final identifying characteristic of narratives is that they typically connect the various parts merely with and then type transitions. You can string the events together by simply saying or writing and then, and then, and then between each one. This is due to the fact that they're organized based on chronology or time, not on any other principle. You can see these features in the Goldilocks example that you read for Chapter 1. The story follows Goldilocks saying what happened in what order. First she found the cabin, then she messed with each bowl of porridge, then she messed with all the beds. Just like any other type of communication, storytelling has certain structural elements that it should include. In this case, things like characters, the plot, what happened, and the setting, where it happened. However, now that you're in college, another type of communication is necessary, one that not only reports information, but also explains and supports a position. Narration is not appropriate for most college-level writing. While students tend to be most familiar with this method and fall back on it by default, exposition is actually the most useful style of communication for college-level writing, because it focuses more on interpretation or explanation rather than simply reporting. One of the most important aspects of exposition is that instead of being organized by time, it's organized by ideas. You could see this demonstrated in the Goldilocks example. One paragraph is about Goldilocks' disobedience to her mother's instructions, one is about her vanity, and one is about selfishness, each including events only as they are relevant to the point being made. Another important feature of exposition is the inclusion of analysis. Not only does it include direct descriptions of what happened, but it also analyzes those events, pointing out the insight the reader was supposed to gain and how it relates to the thesis. This step of including analysis will be discussed later in more detail in Chapter 3, Paragraph Development. Another identifying characteristic of expository writing is the presence of transitions. Because ideas rather than time are the basis of organization, it's important to link sections together using transitions indicating the appropriate logical connection, such as therefore or however, to lead readers along smoothly and to indicate to them how the different pieces of information fit together and should be interpreted. Transitions will be discussed further later in the semester when we go over revision. A final identifying characteristic of expository text is that it has some common structural elements, each of which has its own video mini-lesson separate from this one. First, it has an introduction, which you saw in the Goldilocks exposition example, which commonly gives an overview of the ideas or reasons to be discussed. The introduction also usually includes the thesis statement or main idea to be proven that the essay is structured around. In the Goldilocks exposition example, that's the very first sentence. Goldilocks' own vanity and selfishness cause her demise. The bears are not to blame. The thesis includes both the subject and the argument being made about it. Second, expository writing has body paragraphs, which generally start with topic sentences establishing the idea or argument to be discussed, which you can see in the Goldilocks exposition example by looking at the first sentence in the paragraphs after the introduction. For example, the first topic sentence is, "Firstly, Goldilocks could have avoided the entire situation by following her mother's instructions to be careful and not wander off," which clearly supports the thesis that the end result is her fault and not the bears. Finally, expository texts end with a conclusion that sums up the essay. I invite you to learn more by checking out my conclusion video mini-lecture. So then, connections are key in expository text, particularly since the organization is more abstract. Everything in the paragraph should be tied to the main point and the thesis, particularly at the beginnings and ends of paragraphs, and both analysis and transitional phrases within paragraphs can indicate relationships between important information and ideas. To sum up then, the main differences between the narratives that most students are familiar with and the expository writing they're expected to complete in college lie in two areas. The first is organization and structure. Narration reports events, usually in the order they happen, while exposition uses those events to explain or support a particular point. You can see from this that the differences in organization come from their differences in purpose. For instance, much of the same information is contained in both Goldilocks examples, but the expository example only mentions events as they're relevant to a particular idea, rather than merely reporting everything that happened. Basically, narration lists information, while exposition uses that information to support a particular interpretation or argument. Now that you're in college, it's no longer enough to just present information. Now you must analyze it. Hopefully now you have a clearer idea of the differences between storytelling and the kind of writing that's expected in most college classes, exposition. That wraps up our mini-lecture on narrative versus expository text. Check out my other videos or my textbook for more information. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that this overview was helpful and illuminating. Please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions you may have about the material. I am always happy to help.